The morning of January 6, 1944, High Wycombe, England. Major General James Harold Doolittle walked into the operations room of the 8th Air Force headquarters, carrying a simple but revolutionary order that would horrify his own bomber crews. He was about to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare over Europe, transforming American fighters from protective escorts into hunters. The bombers, those massive flying fortresses carrying 10 men each, would become bait. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Deliberately exposed bait. Within 8 weeks, this decision would help destroy over 500 Luftwaffe aircraft and break the back of German fighter defenses. But first, it would spark outrage among the men whose lives hung in the balance 30,000 feet above Nazi Germany. Doolittle, the 50-year-old aviation pioneer with a doctorate from MIT, had arrived in England just hours before assuming command. He was inheriting an air force bleeding to death. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force had attempted to bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in Germany. Of the 291 B-17 seconds that attacked, 77 were shot down. Another 122 limped home with battle damage. Nearly 600 men were killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. The bomber crews had a grim calculation. Statistically, only 43% would survive their required 25 missions. The mathematics of death were brutally simple. Every time you climbed into that aluminum tube, you had better odds of dying than making it home alive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The prevailing doctrine in January 1944 was defensive. Fighter escorts were ordered to remain glued to the bomber formations, weaving above and around them like shepherds guarding a flock. There was even a sign hanging in the headquarters of the 8th Fighter Command that read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." This defensive mindset had its logic. The bombers, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, 13 weapons per aircraft by late 1943, were supposed to defend themselves through formation flying and overlapping fields of fire. The fighters were there to chase away any German interceptors that got too close. But this strategy had a fatal flaw. German fighter pilots had learned to position themselves well ahead of the bomber streams, forming up outside the range of American escorts. They would make a single devastating pass through the formation, firing their heavy cannons, then dive away before the American fighters could react. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, tethered to the bombers they protected, could do nothing but watch as the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs executed their attacks and escaped. The Luftwaffe had evolved lethal tactics by late 1943. Twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 1-10 and Me 4-10 heavy fighters, called Zerstörer, or destroyers, would approach from head-on, firing 20mm and 30mm cannons from ranges where the bombers' machine guns were ineffective. Single-engine Focke-Wulf 190, as equipped with heavy underwing gun pods as part of specialized Sturmgruppen or storm groups, would attack from behind and below, targeting engines and fuel tanks. The bombers, flying in their combat box formations at speeds barely exceeding 200 miles per hour, were vulnerable despite their defensive firepower. A single 30mm shell could blow an engine apart. 2 or 3 hits could send a B-17 spiraling earthward, its crew trapped inside. By December 1943, General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, had reached a terrifying conclusion. Unless the Luftwaffe was destroyed before June 1944, Operation Overlord, the planned invasion of Normandy, would fail. German fighters would savage the invasion fleet on the beaches. They would strafe the landing craft. They would turn the sand red. Arnold's message to Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz, commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, was unambiguous. Destroy the German Air Force in the air, on the ground, and in the factories. Everything else was secondary. The bombers themselves were no longer the point. They were the means to force the Luftwaffe into combat, where American fighters could kill German pilots. This was the crisis Doolittle inherited on January 6, 1944. The 8th Air Force had 461 operational bombers and 274 operational fighters. Those numbers represented a force that had been bled down by months of devastating losses. American bomber production was replacing the lost aircraft. New B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds rolled off assembly lines in Seattle, San Diego, and Fort Worth at a staggering rate. But the Luftwaffe was also growing. By early 1944, the German aircraft industry was producing between 2,000 and 3,000 fighters per month. The arms race seemed to favor Germany. They were defending interior lines, operating from bases close to their targets, while American bombers had to cross the North Sea and penetrate hundreds of miles into hostile territory. But there was a critical difference that Doolittle and Spaatz understood. Germany could replace aircraft. What they could not replace were experienced pilots. The Luftwaffe's training program, comprehensive and thorough in 1941 and 1942, had collapsed under the pressure of a three-front war. Training hours for new German fighter pilots had been slashed. In 1941, a German fighter pilot received between 200 and 250 hours of training before entering combat. By 1943, that had been cut to 150 hours. By mid-1944, it would fall below 100 hours. Meanwhile, the American pipeline was expanding. By early 1944, new American fighter pilots entered combat with an average of 450 hours of training, including 250 hours in advanced fighters. The quality gap was growing, but only if American pilots could engage German fighters in combat rather than remaining tethered to the bombers. Doolittle made his decision within days of taking command. On a visit to the headquarters of Major General William Kepner, who commanded the 8th Fighter Command, Doolittle saw that sign. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. He told Kepner to take it down. It was wrong. A new sign went up. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. That sentence represented the most important and far-reaching military decision Doolittle would make during the war. The fighters would be freed. They would fly ahead of the bomber formations, sweeping the sky clear of German interceptors before they could form up for attack. They would pursue German fighters wherever they fled, to the deck if necessary. They would strafe German airfields on the return flight, catching the Luftwaffe on the ground while refueling and rearming. The bomber formations would still have escorts, but the primary mission had changed from defense to offense, from protection to destruction. The bomber crews hated it. They felt abandoned. When fighter groups began implementing the new tactics, bomber gunners watched their escorts peel away and disappear over the horizon, hunting for German fighters miles ahead of the bomber stream. The B-17 and B-24 crews suddenly felt naked, exposed, vulnerable. There was talk of mutiny. Some bomber crews openly stated they felt betrayed. They had signed up to fly combat missions with fighter protection. Now that protection was vanishing, chasing German interceptors that might or might not exist while the bombers flew on alone into the teeth of German air defenses. Morale in the bomber groups plummeted, but Doolittle and Spaatz held firm. The strategy was not about protecting individual bomber missions. It was about destroying the Luftwaffe entirely, making German fighters afraid to take off, killing so many German pilots that the survivors would be inexperienced teenagers who could barely fly straight, let alone engage in combat. The timing of Doolittle's tactical revolution coincided with a technological breakthrough. Through late 1943, American fighter escorts consisted primarily of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and Lockheed P-38 Lightnings. Both were capable aircraft, but both had range limitations. The P-47, a massive radial engine fighter weighing nearly 8 tons fully loaded, could escort bombers about 300 miles from England. The P-38, a twin-engine design with distinctive twin booms, could fly slightly farther, but mechanical problems plagued the type in the cold, damp European climate. Neither could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip exceeding 1,000 miles. German fighters learned to wait, lurking beyond the range of American escorts, attacking the bombers once the P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds had turned for home with their fuel tanks running low. But in December 1943 and January 1944, a third fighter type began arriving in England in substantial numbers. The North American P-51 Mustang, fitted with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, could escort bombers all the way to any target in Germany and return. With external drop tanks, Mustangs had a combat radius exceeding 600 miles. They were fast, capable of over 400 miles per hour at high altitude. They were maneuverable, more agile than the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190, and they were, arriving by the hundreds. By February 1944, the 8th Air Force had re-equipped multiple fighter groups with Mustangs. The 55th Fighter Group flying P-38 seconds, the 4th Fighter Group flying P-47 seconds, the 354th and 357th Fighter Groups received their P-51 seconds and began operations. The combination of Doolittle's offensive fighter tactics and the long-range Mustang created a lethal threat to the Luftwaffe. The first implementation of the new fighter tactics occurred on January 7, 1944, one day after Doolittle took command. Fighter groups began using phased escort tactics that had been in development for months. Instead of the entire fighter force sticking close to the bombers, fighters would be divided into relay teams. Short-range P-47 seconds would escort the bombers over the North Sea and into Germany until their fuel ran low, then turn back. Long-range P-38 seconds and P-51 seconds would take over deeper in German territory, providing protection over the target. Finally, as the bombers turned for home, another wave of P-47 seconds would meet them for the return journey. This relay system provided continuous coverage, but still kept the fighters close to the bombers. Doolittle's innovation was to free entire fighter groups from the relay system. Instead of cycling fighters through close escort duty, entire squadrons of Mustangs would fly 25 to 50 miles ahead of the bomber stream, acting as a sweeping force. They would locate German fighters forming up for attack and engage them before the Germans could reach the bombers. This required American pilots to act aggressively, to seek combat rather than avoid it, to chase German fighters down to treetop level if necessary. It also required American pilots to risk their lives more deliberately. Close escort was reactive, responding to attacks. Fighter sweeps were proactive, deliberately seeking combat against an enemy that had the advantage of numbers and position. By late January 1944, the results of Doolittle's new tactics began to show. Luftwaffe losses rose sharply. In January, the German fighter force wrote off over 30% of its single-engine fighters. Nearly 17% of Luftwaffe fighter pilots were lost killed, wounded, or missing. This catastrophic attrition rate reflected not just American fighter sweeps, but the overall pressure of defending against 1,000-bomber raids. German fighter pilots were flying multiple sorties per day, scrambling to intercept one bomber stream only to land, refuel, and take off again to intercept another. Fatigue accumulated, judgment deteriorated, mistakes became fatal, and increasingly, German fighters were being caught by roaming Mustangs while climbing to altitude or forming up their attack formations. The weather in January 1944 was abysmal. Heavy clouds blanketed much of northern Europe. Visibility was poor. Icing conditions made high-altitude flight treacherous. But the Americans pressed on, flying missions whenever a weather window opened. The pressure was relentless. German fighter pilots had no rest, no respite. Their training pipeline could not keep up with casualties. New pilots arrived at frontline units with minimal flight time, often less than 100 hours. These young men, many still teenagers, were thrown into combat against experienced American pilots who had survived months of operations. The outcome was predictable. German fighter units reported accidents and losses from inexperienced pilots almost as frequently as combat casualties. One German fighter Gruppe scrambled 21 aircraft for a second sortie against an American formation. They achieved 2 victories but lost 4 aircraft missing, 1 pilot killed in a crash landing, 3 pilots bailing out, 1 aircraft damaged in a belly landing, and 3 more aircraft crashing on takeoff. This catastrophic loss rate, 7 aircraft destroyed and 3 damaged out of 21 launched, with only 2 enemy bombers shot down, represented the death spiral of the Luftwaffe fighter force. By mid-February 1944, Doolittle and Spaatz were ready to launch their decisive blow against the Luftwaffe. They called it Operation Argument, a coordinated campaign to force the German Air Force into a battle of attrition it could not win. The targets would be German aircraft factories, facilities the Luftwaffe absolutely had to defend, locations like Leipzig, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Augsburg, and Gotha, where Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs were assembled. The Americans would send massive formations, over 1,000 bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters. The Luftwaffe would have to respond. They would have to scramble every available fighter to defend their production centers. And when they did, American fighters would be waiting. The operation required good weather, at least relatively good weather for northern Europe in winter. The bombers needed to see their targets for accurate bombing with the Norden bomb sight. The fighters needed clear skies to spot and engage German interceptors. Through early February, weather reconnaissance aircraft brought back discouraging reports. Clouds blanketed Germany, visibility was poor, forecasters predicted continuing bad weather. But by February 19th, the long-range weather forecast suggested a brief window might open. The forecast was uncertain, questionable even. Ice formed at high altitude. Clouds still covered many target areas. The risk of collisions during assembly over England was significant. Doolittle himself advised against launching, but the order came down. Go. On Sunday morning, February 20th, 1944, at bomber bases across eastern England, crews were awakened at 3 in the morning. They ate breakfast in mess halls, eggs and toast and coffee, the same meal before every mission. They attended briefings where intelligence officers pulled back curtains to reveal target maps. Groans filled the briefing rooms when crews saw the red lines stretching deep into central Germany. These were not coastal targets where fighters could provide maximum protection. These were penetrations into the heart of the Reich. The bomber crews climbed into their aircraft. Ground crews helped load ammunition belts for the machine guns. Bombardiers armed their bomb loads. Engines coughed to life, first 1, then 2, then 3, then all 4 radial engines on each B-17, all 4 on each B-24. The noise was deafening as over 1,000 heavy bombers began their takeoff rolls. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The launch of Big Week on February 20th was organized chaos. Over 1,000 bombers from the 8th Air Force took off from bases across East Anglia. They circled, gaining altitude, forming into elements, squadrons, groups, wings, and finally air divisions. Each bomber found its position in the 3-dimensional chess game of the combat box formation. Lead groups flew at 20,000 feet. High groups flew 500 feet higher and off to one side. Low groups flew at 19,500 feet on the opposite side. This staggered formation allowed overlapping fields of fire from defensive machine guns while maintaining the tight spacing needed for accurate bombing. It took hours for the formations to assemble. Meanwhile, 835 fighters prepared to escort them. P-47 Thunderbolts from groups near the coast would provide initial escort. P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs would take over deeper into Germany. RAF Spitfire squadrons would supplement the American escorts. The first day of Big Week targeted aircraft factories at Leipzig, Bernburg and Oschersleben in central Germany, along with Brunswick further north. The 15th Air Force, flying from bases in southern Italy, would hit Regensburg simultaneously, forcing the Luftwaffe to defend on 2 fronts. This was the essence of Doolittle's strategy: overwhelming force, multiple targets, continuous pressure. The bombers successfully struck their targets, dropping over 2,200 tons of bombs. But the cost was significant. 21 bombers were lost from the 8th Air Force, another 4 from the 15th. American fighters claimed over 60 German aircraft destroyed. The actual German losses were difficult to verify in the chaos of aerial combat, but Luftwaffe units reported heavy casualties. More importantly, the campaign had begun. The Luftwaffe had responded in force, exactly as American planners intended. The second day, February 21st, weather over primary targets remained poor. Cloud cover obscured the German aircraft factories. 8th Air Force bombers attacked secondary targets, mainly airfields in Holland and Western Germany. The 392nd Bomb Group bombed the Luftwaffe fighter base at Vorden, northeast of Arnhem. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Results were good, cratering runways and destroying parked aircraft, but cost another bomber and crew. The 8th lost 19 bombers and 5 fighters that day. American fighter pilots claimed 60 German aircraft destroyed. The pattern was established: continuous operations, relentless pressure, forcing the Luftwaffe to scramble fighters day after day with no rest. February 22nd brought a recall. Weather over the primary targets, including Gotha, deteriorated so badly that mission controllers ordered the bombers to turn back. Some bomb groups attacked targets of opportunity in Holland and Western Germany before returning to England. No major losses occurred, but the frustration was palpable. Doolittle wanted to maintain pressure, to give the Luftwaffe no breathing room. Every day without operations allowed German fighter units to rest, refit, and prepare. But February 23rd brought better weather. The target list for that day was ambitious: Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Gotha, Eisenach, and Oschersleben. Over 500 bombers from the 8th Air Force and nearly 200 from the 15th Air Force would attack. The escort force numbered over 600 fighters. This was the largest coordinated strike of Big Week. The Luftwaffe response was massive and desperate. German fighter controllers scrambled everything that could fly: Messerschmitt Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 1, 3, and 11. Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 2, 26, and 54. The twin-engine Bf-110s and Me-410s from Zerstörerschwader 26. Over 400 German fighters rose to meet the American Armada. The battles on February 23rd were some of the most intense of the European air war. American bomber formations approaching their targets were swarmed by German fighters. Foe 190s made head-on passes, their 20mm and 30mm cannons tearing into lead bombers. Bf-109s attacked from behind and below, aiming for engines and control surfaces. But this time, the outcome was different. American P-51 Mustangs, flying well ahead of the bomber stream in their fighter sweep role, caught many German fighters while they were still climbing to attack altitude. German pilots, focused on reaching position ahead of the bombers, found themselves under attack from above and behind. Mustangs dived out of the sun, their 650 caliber machine guns blazing. German fighters fell away, trailing smoke and flames. Pilots bailed out over their own territory. Others fought back, turning into their attackers, trying to gain altitude and position. But the P-51 had advantages: speed, maneuverability, and most crucially, pilot experience. The dogfights sprawled across hundreds of miles of German airspace. The cost was heavy on both sides. The 8th Air Force lost 44 bombers that day. The 15th lost 17. American fighter losses totaled 11 aircraft, but the Luftwaffe suffered catastrophic damage. American pilots claimed over 170 German aircraft destroyed. The actual number was likely lower. Overclaiming was common in the confusion of aerial combat, but Luftwaffe records confirm massive losses. Multiple Geschwader reported significant pilot casualties. JG-11 lost 7 pilots killed and 9 wounded in a single engagement. The twin-engine Zerstörer units suffered worst of all. Their Bf-1-10 and Me-4-10 heavy fighters, already obsolete in combat against Mustangs, were slaughtered. One Group A from ZG-26 lost 9 aircraft and 6 pilots in minutes when it encountered a full squadron of Mustangs. The surviving crews reported they never reached the bombers. They were intercepted during their climb-out and decimated. February 24th and 25th brought similar operations. On the 24th, the primary targets were Rostock, Schweinfurt again, and Gotha. Over 229 bombers were dispatched from the 8th Air Force despite continuing weather problems. Fighter escort included another wave of Mustangs flying offensive sweeps. The pattern was now established. Fighters ranging far ahead of the bombers, engaging German interceptors before they could form up their attacks, then strafing German airfields during the return flight. The Luftwaffe was being hit at every stage, on the ground during takeoff, in the air while climbing to altitude, during combat over the bomber streams, while landing and refueling, and finally with their aircraft parked on the ground. There was no safe phase of operations. The final day of Big Week, February 25th, targeted Augsburg, Stuttgart, Regensburg, and Fürth. The 8th Air Force dispatched over 400 bombers. The 15th added another 160 from Italy. Fighter escort approached 700 aircraft. This massive force represented the culmination of Big Week: overwhelming numbers, continuous pressure, and aggressive fighter tactics all combined. The results that day demonstrated how effective the campaign had been. American bombers reached their targets with relatively light opposition. The Luftwaffe response was noticeably weaker than earlier in the week. German fighter units were exhausted, depleted, their pilots dead or wounded, their aircraft destroyed. The 8th Air Force lost 33 bombers and 3 fighters on February 25th. The Germans lost approximately 70 aircraft. The ratio had shifted decisively in favor of the Americans. When Big Week concluded on February 25th, the statistics told the story. The 8th Air Force had flown approximately 3,000 bomber sorties over 6 days of operations, supported by over 3,000 fighter sorties. The RAF Bomber Command had flown several thousand additional night missions against the same targets. Together, the Allies dropped approximately 20,000 tons of bombs on German aircraft production facilities. The cost was significant. The 8th Air Force lost 228 heavy bombers, including those scrapped after returning with battle damage too severe to repair. The 15th Air Force lost 90 bombers. Fighter losses totaled 28 aircraft. Approximately 2,800 American aircrew were killed, wounded, or captured, but the Luftwaffe's losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. American bomber gunners and fighter pilots claimed over 500 German aircraft destroyed during Big Week. This number was certainly exaggerated. In the heat of combat, multiple pilots and gunners often claimed the same kill, and aircraft reported destroyed actually limped home to crash land at their bases. But even accepting significant overclaiming, the actual German losses were devastating. Luftwaffe records confirm the loss of at least 300 aircraft destroyed and another 100 damaged beyond immediate repair. More importantly, 17% of the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots were lost during Big Week, nearly 100 killed and dozens more wounded. These were not just any pilots. Many were experienced squadron and flight leaders, men with hundreds of combat hours who formed the backbone of Luftwaffe fighter operations. The damage to German aircraft production was actually less significant than planners hoped. While bombs hit the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, the Focke-Wulf facility at Oschersleben, and ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, German industry proved remarkably resilient. Production was dispersed to smaller facilities. Slave labor from concentration camps was mobilized to clear rubble and restore assembly lines. German fighter production actually continued to increase through 1944, eventually peaking at over 3,000 aircraft per month. But this production surge could not compensate for the real crisis facing the Luftwaffe: the collapse of the pilot training program and the catastrophic attrition of experienced aircrew. The statistics tell the grim arithmetic of the Luftwaffe's death spiral in early 1944. In January, German fighter forces lost over 30% of their aircraft and nearly 17% of their pilots. In February, losses reached 56% of aircraft and continued high pilot casualties. The Luftwaffe could build more Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. German industry had proven capable of remarkable feats of production under Albert Speer's management. But Germany could not produce experienced pilots. Training programs that once produced men with 250 hours of flight time were now graduating pilots with less than 100 hours. These inexperienced pilots, many barely out of their teens, were being sent into combat against American pilots with 450 hours of training. The outcome was predictable and horrible. By March 1944, the impact of Doolittle's fighter tactics was unmistakable. On March 3rd and 4th, the 8th Air Force launched its first missions to Berlin. The German capital had never been attacked in daylight by American bombers. The psychological impact was enormous, but more significant was the ease with which the missions were executed. Mustang escorts flew all the way to Berlin and back, sweeping ahead of the bomber formations, engaging German interceptors before they could threaten the bombers. The Luftwaffe response was weak and disorganized. Fighter units that had seemed invincible 6 months earlier could barely put up squadron-strength formations. Entire Jagdgeschwader were grounded for lack of serviceable aircraft or qualified pilots. On March 8, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched another massive raid against Berlin. Over 600 heavy bombers attacked, escorted by over 800 fighters. The escort included full Mustang groups flying fighter sweeps far ahead of the bomber stream. German opposition was sporadic and ineffective. American fighters strafed German airfields at will during the return flight, destroying aircraft parked on the ground. The Luftwaffe was collapsing, not immediately, not completely, but the erosion was terminal. Each mission killed more experienced German pilots. Each day saw more Mustangs arrive in England. Each week saw American pilot quality improve as combat veterans accumulated experience. The ratio was turning catastrophic for Germany. Experienced American pilots were killing inexperienced German pilots at unsustainable rates. The individual stories from this period illustrate the human cost behind the statistics. Oberleutnant Hans Waldmann, a Luftwaffe ace with over 40 victories, was killed on February 22 when his Bf 109 was shot down by a P-51 over Gotha. He was 24 years old. Lieutenant Kurt Fischer, who had survived 2 years of combat on the Eastern Front, was shot down over Regensburg on February 25. He bailed out with severe burns and never flew combat again. Hauptmann Horst Ademate, commander of 2 Gruppe of JG-54, with over 166 victories, was killed on August 8, 1944, when his aircraft was hit by flak over Russia. But by then, the Eastern Front had become almost a relief posting compared to the slaughter over Germany, where American fighters dominated the skies. For the Americans, Big Week and the following operations in March established air superiority. The term air superiority has specific military meaning. It describes a situation where one side can conduct air operations without prohibitive interference from enemy air forces. By early April 1944, the Allies had achieved air superiority over Western Europe. German fighters could still mount attacks. The Luftwaffe was not destroyed. It would continue fighting until May 1945. But German fighters no longer controlled the airspace over their own territory. They could not prevent American and British bombers from striking targets throughout Germany. They could not prevent Allied reconnaissance aircraft from photographing every German airfield and factory. They could not interfere significantly with the build-up for Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The achievement of air superiority by April 1944 made D-Day possible. On June 6, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe mounted only limited, ineffective attacks against the invasion fleet. German fighters that did appear were quickly shot down or driven off. Allied aircraft flew over 14,000 sorties on D-Day, supporting the landing forces, interdicting German reinforcements, protecting the fleet. The Luftwaffe flew about 300 sorties. The disparity was overwhelming and decisive. General Dwight Eisenhower later stated that air supremacy was the single most important factor enabling the success of Overlord. Without control of the air, the invasion would have been far costlier, or perhaps impossible. Doolittle's decision in January 1944 to free the fighters, to transform them from defensive escorts to offensive hunters, was the key that unlocked Allied air supremacy. The decision was controversial, unpopular with bomber crews, and initially costly. Bomber losses actually increased slightly in January and February, even as German losses skyrocketed. But the strategic calculation was sound. By accepting short-term risk to the bombers, Doolittle accelerated the destruction of the Luftwaffe. The mathematics of attrition worked in America's favor. Every German pilot killed was irreplaceable, while every American pilot lost could be replaced by a better-trained aviator from the expanding training pipeline. From January 6th to the end of February 1944, in just 8 weeks of operations, Doolittle's offensive fighter tactics, combined with aggressive use of long-range Mustangs, had destroyed the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force over Western Europe. The claimed 500 German aircraft destroyed during Big Week alone, while exaggerated, represented a genuine catastrophe for German air defences. Even accepting half that number as actual kills, the losses were unsustainable. Adding January losses and those from early March, the total German fighter losses in this period exceeded 1,000 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair, with pilot casualties approaching 30% of the entire fighter force. The German pilot who flew combat over the Reich in early 1944 faced an impossible situation. Unlike bomber crews of any nation, who could count missions and hope to complete their tour, German fighter pilots had no limit. They flew until they were killed, wounded too severely to continue, or the war ended. They were defending their homeland, but that meant they had nowhere to escape. Every mission was over German territory. Every combat occurred in sight of German cities and families. The psychological strain was enormous, fatigue accumulated, judgment deteriorated, and increasingly, the enemy they faced had every advantage: better aircraft, more fuel, superior training, and overwhelming numbers. One Luftwaffe pilot, interviewed after the war, described the hopelessness of early 1944. "We would scramble to intercept the bombers, climbing as fast as possible to reach attack altitude. But before we could get into position, the Mustangs would be on us. They came out of the sun, diving at tremendous speed. You might see your wingman explode, hit by .50 caliber fire, and have only seconds to react before you were under attack yourself. If you survived the initial bounce, you might engage in a turning fight. But the P-51 could outturn our Bf-109 at high altitude. If you tried to dive away, they were faster. If you tried to climb, they followed. The only hope was to get to cloud cover or to fly low over German flak positions where the Americans would not follow. But even then, on the return flight, Mustangs would strafe our airfields while we were landing and when we were most vulnerable. The transformation of American fighter tactics in early 1944 represented more than a tactical innovation. It demonstrated a fundamental principle of warfare: offense dominates defense when properly executed. Before Doolittle's reforms, American fighters had been reactive, responding to German attacks. After January 6, 1944, American fighters became proactive, seeking combat and dictating the terms of engagement. This shift from defensive to offensive operations multiplied the effectiveness of American air power exponentially. German fighter pilots who had felt relatively safe, forming up their attacks beyond the range of American escorts, now found themselves under attack during their most vulnerable moments, climbing to altitude, joining formations, preparing to attack. The impact on German fighter pilot morale was severe and measurable. Luftwaffe units reported increasing numbers of pilots who showed signs of combat fatigue, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who had been aggressive, confident fighter pilots became hesitant, defensive. Some experienced pilots requested transfers to night fighter units where they would face British bombers rather than American fighters. The night war was dangerous. RAF Bomber Command casualties were appalling, but at least the combat was predictable. You intercepted bombers in darkness using radar. You did not face swarms of Mustangs that could chase you across hundreds of miles of sky. The psychological advantage had shifted completely to the Americans. German pilots knew they were outnumbered, knew their training was inferior, knew their chances of survival decreased with every mission. This knowledge became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Hesitation in combat is fatal. Defensive flying gets you killed. German pilots were being taught caution at exactly the moment when aggression was their only hope. Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdflieger responsible for all Luftwaffe fighter operations, recognized the crisis immediately. In a report dated April 27, 1944, Galland documented the catastrophic losses of the previous 3 months. 500 aircraft and 400 pilots had been lost in just the last 10 major operations. These numbers represented approximately 20% of the entire fighter force in the West. Galland argued for radical changes: withdraw fighters from less critical fronts, concentrate all available aircraft for defense of the Reich, increase production of the Me-262 jet fighter, which had speed advantages over any Allied fighter. But his recommendations were ignored or implemented too late. The jet fighter program, which might have changed the equation if prioritized in 1942, would not produce combat-ready aircraft in meaningful numbers until 1945, when Germany had already lost the war. The collapse of the Luftwaffe's fighter force in early 1944 had cascading effects on all aspects of Germany's war effort. Reconnaissance aircraft that had provided intelligence on Allied preparations could no longer operate safely. Tactical bombers that had supported Wehrmacht ground operations were withdrawn for defense of the Reich. Transport aircraft that supplied isolated German garrisons were shot down in increasing numbers. By spring 1944, Allied air superiority affected every German military operation. Ground forces advancing or withdrawing faced constant air attack. Supply convoys moved only at night. Railroad marshalling yards were bombed repeatedly, crippling German logistics. The industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, came under constant bombardment without effective fighter protection. German industry could still produce weapons, but moving those weapons to the front became increasingly difficult. The toll on German cities from unchallenged Allied bombing in spring and summer 1944 was catastrophic. Hamburg, Cologne, Frankfurt, Munich, Berlin itself, all suffered massive destruction. The debate over strategic bombing's effectiveness remains contentious among historians, but what is certain is that by mid-1944, Allied bombers faced far less effective opposition than in 1943. Bomber loss rates dropped from over 5% per mission to under 2%. This allowed sustained campaigns that previous losses would have made impossible. The bombing of German synthetic oil production, which began in earnest in May 1944, reduced German fuel supplies from 180,000 tons per month in April to 50,000 tons in July and just 10,000 tons in August. This fuel crisis crippled German mobility on all fronts. Tanks sat immobile for lack of gasoline. Fighter aircraft were grounded. The Luftwaffe had planes but no fuel to fly them, another bitter irony of Germany's strategic situation. For the American bomber crews who had felt abandoned by Doolittle's new fighter tactics, the results eventually justified the strategy. By April 1944, bomber loss rates had dropped substantially. Missions that would have cost 50 or 60 bombers in October 1943 now cost 20 or 30. By July, losses often numbered in single digits per 1,000 bomber raid. Crews still faced tremendous danger. German anti-aircraft artillery remained lethal. Flak was responsible for more bomber losses than fighters by mid-1944. But the terror of mass fighter attacks diminished. Bomber crews began to see P-51 Mustangs strafing German airfields during the return flight, destroying aircraft on the ground, killing pilots in their dispersal areas. The escorts were hunting rather than hiding. That visible aggression boosted morale more than any protective formation could have. The fighter pilots themselves, freed from close escort duty, flourished in their new offensive role. American aces emerged from the campaign of early 1944 with victory tallies that would have been impossible under the old defensive tactics. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts, became one of the war's most successful fighter leaders. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group, flying P-51 Mustangs, would finish the war with over 26 confirmed victories before his death in December 1944. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group became a media sensation, photographed and interviewed, his exploits followed by newspapers back home. These men were not reckless, glory seekers. They were skilled professionals executing an aggressive strategy that saved lives by destroying enemy capabilities. Their individual achievements represented the collective success of Doolittle's tactical revolution. The P-51 Mustang itself deserves recognition as perhaps the most important Allied aircraft of the European War. The Mustang combined range, speed, maneuverability, and firepower in unprecedented fashion. Its liquid-cooled Merlin engine provided power at high altitude where most combat occurred. Its laminar flow wing design reduced drag and increased efficiency. 6 50-caliber machine guns provided devastating firepower. A 2-second burst put nearly 200 rounds into a target. The Mustang could escort bombers to any target in Europe and still have fuel for combat and the return flight. It could dogfight with any German fighter and win through a combination of performance and superior pilot training. And it was available in thousands. American industry produced over 15,000 P-51 seconds during the war. This production volume, combined with the aircraft's capabilities, made it the instrument of Allied air supremacy over Europe. But technology alone did not win the air war. The human element, pilot quality, determined outcomes. American pilot training in 1944 was the best in the world. New pilots arrived in England with 450 hours of flight time, including extensive gunnery training, formation flying, instrument procedures, and combat tactics. They were physically fit, well-fed, properly clothed for high-altitude operations. They had confidence in their aircraft and their leadership. Compare this to the German pilot in spring 1944. Less than 100 hours of training, inadequate instrument flying skills, sometimes only 15 or 20 hours in the actual fighter type he would fly in combat. German pilots were often physically exhausted, malnourished due to declining food, rations, lacking proper oxygen equipment. They had lost confidence in their leadership after watching Goering blame them for failures that were systemic rather than individual. The human dimension of warfare favored America overwhelmingly. The strategic significance of Doolittle's achievement in early 1944 cannot be overstated. Air supremacy over Europe made D-Day possible, protected the invasion fleet, and allowed Allied armies to advance with overwhelming tactical air support. Without air supremacy, Operation Overlord would have been far bloodier or might have failed entirely. Imagine Normandy beaches under sustained Luftwaffe attack, German fighters strafing landing craft, Stukas dive-bombing the invasion fleet. Instead, Allied soldiers landed under an umbrella of complete air protection. German reinforcements moving toward Normandy were bombed and strafed. German armour concentrating for counterattacks was spotted by reconnaissance aircraft and hit by fighter bombers. The air battle won in January through March 1944 paid dividends for the rest of the war. Doolittle himself never claimed sole credit for the victory. He consistently praised Spaatz for the overall strategic vision, credited the fighter pilots who executed the tactics, honoured the bomber crews who flew into danger as bait for the German fighters. In his post-war writings, Doolittle emphasized the collaborative nature of the achievement. The air war against Germany was won during the phase of our operations between the beginning of February 1944 and D-Day, he wrote. The rate of attrition of the Luftwaffe's pilots exceeded Germany's rate of replacement. Also, the several months of reduced aircraft production during a crucial period created a shortage of reserve aircraft that was difficult to overcome. Thus, Germany was low in two essentials at a critical point: aircraft and pilots. This assessment, characteristically modest, accurately captured the mathematics of victory. The title of this story calls Doolittle a mad general, but the evidence suggests otherwise. The decision to free the fighters appeared mad to those who did not understand the strategy. Bomber crews felt abandoned. Traditional theorists believed escort fighters should remain close to their bombers, but Doolittle's decision was not mad. It was calculated, strategic, and based on sound military principles. He understood that defensive tactics could not win the air war. Only offensive operations, seeking combat and destroying the enemy at their source, could achieve air superiority. The decision required moral courage. Bomber losses initially remained high. Criticism was intense. But Doolittle held firm because the mathematics were clear. Kill German pilots faster than they could be replaced, and eventually the Luftwaffe would collapse. That is exactly what happened. The destruction of over 500 German aircraft during Big Week alone, even accounting for overclaiming, represented a devastating blow to the Luftwaffe. But the real damage was cumulative. January losses of 30% of aircraft and 17% of pilots. February losses of 56% of aircraft and continued high pilot casualties. March continuing the pattern of unsustainable attrition. By April 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force in the West was combat ineffective. Individual units could still mount attacks. Skilled pilots like Galland could still achieve victories, but systemic collapse had occurred. The force could not defend German airspace, could not protect German cities, could not prevent Allied bombers from operating with relative impunity. The broader lessons of Doolittle's campaign remain relevant for modern military operations. Offense dominates defense when executed with sufficient force and competent leadership. Technology matters. The P-51 Mustang was crucial, but training and tactics matter more. Quality beats quantity, when the quality gap is substantial. Better trained American pilots defeated numerically superior German forces through skill and aggression. Most fundamentally, the campaign demonstrated that winning wars requires accepting risk. Doolittle's decision to free the fighters put bombers at greater immediate risk, but that calculated risk paid enormous strategic dividends. Leaders who refuse all risk, who prioritize short-term safety over long-term victory, ultimately fail. Doolittle understood that war is inherently dangerous, and victory requires aggressive action despite inevitable casualties. For the German fighter pilots who survived the campaign, the trauma lasted decades. Post-war interviews with Luftwaffe veterans reveal the psychological scars of that period. They describe the helplessness of watching friends die in combat day after day. They describe the frustration of knowing they were outnumbered and outclassed but being ordered to fight anyway. They describe the guilt of survival when so many died. Some German pilots became outstanding citizens of post-war Germany, channeling their military discipline into productive civilian careers. Others struggled with alcoholism, depression, and survivor's guilt. The human cost of the air war affected both sides, though American pilots at least had the comfort of winning and the knowledge that their sacrifices had purpose. The statistics tell one story: 500-plus German aircraft destroyed in 3 weeks, catastrophic pilot losses, the achievement of air superiority. But behind those statistics are individual stories. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, flying a P-47, was hit by German fire in June 1943 and managed to nurse his damaged aircraft back to England. He survived, became an ace with 27 victories, and lived until 2004. Hauptmann Walter Nowotny, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 258 victories, mostly on 10, at the Eastern Front, was killed in November 1944 when his Me-262 jet fighter was shot down shortly after takeoff. Every aircraft lost represented a human story, a family receiving terrible news, a life cut short or forever changed. The final accounting of Doolittle's campaign reveals a masterpiece of strategic thinking executed through tactical innovation. In 8 weeks, from January 6 to early March 1944, American fighters transitioned from defensive escorts to offensive hunters. The implementation of fighter sweeps, allowing escorts to range far ahead of bombers and engage German fighters proactively, proved devastatingly effective. The introduction of long-range P-51 Mustangs in large numbers provided the tool to execute the strategy. The result was the destruction of the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force over Western Europe. The claimed 500 aircraft destroyed during Big Week was likely exaggerated, but even accepting half that number, combined with January and March losses, the total German fighter losses exceeded sustainable rates. Pilot casualties approached 30% of the force. Training could not replace lost experience. Fuel shortages grounded available aircraft. By June 6, 1944, when Allied armies landed in Normandy, German fighters were conspicuous by their absence. Air supremacy had been achieved at a cost measured in thousands of Allied lives and tens of thousands of German lives, but achieved nonetheless. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Doolittle's transformation, from controversial to vindicated leader, occurred within months. In January 1944, bomber crews cursed his name as their escorts disappeared over the horizon. By June, those same crews recognized that the aggressive fighter tactics had saved their lives by destroying the Luftwaffe before it could destroy them. History vindicated Doolittle's strategic vision. The air war over Europe was won not by defensive tactics but by offensive aggression, not by protecting bombers but by destroying fighters, not by playing it safe but by accepting calculated risks. This is the lesson of how one general's fighter sweeps destroyed over 500 Luftwaffe planes in 3 weeks and changed the course of the war. It is a lesson in courage, strategy, and the mathematics of warfare. It is the story of how America won air supremacy over Europe and made victory possible on D-Day and beyond. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.